Hello everyone, this is Professor Kent. Today's recording is to do some questions from chapter 1 and just to help you understand the material that was covered in chapter 1. The first thing here is we're going to answer some of the questions to refresh your memory. The first question is in income tax, when we're thinking of it, the major source of federal revenue is the personal income tax. When we think of a federal government, most of the revenue comes from personal income tax. As you and me, we pay taxes, so we pay personal taxes. Indicated 3 other type of taxes that contributes to this revenue. So we know this is the major source comes from the personal income tax, but there's 3 other ones. Let's see, I could give you an example. If it's the individual pay income tax, corporations also pay income tax. So the revenue will also come from corporate income tax. Now the revenue will also come from GST. Now the revenue also comes from, if I were to say, non-residents. So of course, if you're resident, you will be paying taxes. If you're non-resident, you will also be contributing to the revenue through the income tax. Then what we have is we also have something called custom and imports. So import tax, so import duty. So if as an individual, what you're doing is you're ordering something from US or somewhere, you pay duty. So it could be from any other country that you're coming, that is an international. We call it custom import duties. The other revenue comes from employment insurance. So the other revenue is coming from employment insurance premium. So these are some of the examples that contribute to the federal revenue other than the personal income tax. Now we also learned in chapter 1 was that now what is the meaning of a person? Person is not just an individual. In Income Tax Act, the term person refers to what? It refers to, of course, individual, a corporation also is an individual. We could also have trust, and we can also have an estate. That is also under the Income Tax Act. The person is also an individual, a corporation, a trust, and an estate. Now going further, we also learned that under what circumstances will a person who's not a resident of Canada will be liable for Canadian income tax. So who will be the person? In this case, we know the person is individual, corporation, trust, and estate, who's liable for Canadian taxes. Now, if I were to think about it, if a non-resident, they think who's not a non-resident. Now, if it's a non-resident, we know that a non-resident person, who earns, I'm just going to write it, who earns employment income. He or she is not a resident of Canada, but earns an employment income in Canada. Then they're liable for Canadian tax. So they're liable for Canadian tax. Now, if I were to think a person who's a non-resident who carry on a business, if an individual carry on a business or a corporation carry on a business, in Canada, they will be liable for tax. A carry on business in Canada they will be liable for taxes. The other one is if a person, so we know person could be individual, a corporation, trust, and estate, if they have a gain on disposal of a taxable property. I'm just going to say, when we think of a property, we're only thinking of a Canadian property. If that's the case, they will be liable for Canadian income tax. Now, this is a sort of a multiple choice question that is we wanted to take up and see if we know what makes somebody a residence or a deemed residence, or sometimes we call it a factual residence. That's what it is. Now, going through each of them, we wanted to know what, when we read it, we needed to know what makes them a resident or a deemed resident, or we can also call it a factual residence. So let's go through each one. So in this case, they said that Alex is a U.S. Canadian citizen. If he's a U.S. Canadian citizen, then of course will be a U.S. The person will be paying U.S. taxes. We wanted to know which applies out of this, which applies to who is Canadian. In this case, there's supposed to be a multiple choice question. In this case, the multiple choice question was A, B, and C. This is the requirement. So this is the sort of the question. We're supposed to have A, B, C, and D. Under A, we have Alex, Bob, and Charles. Under B, we have a Bob, Charles, and Richard. Under C, we have a Bob and Charles. Under D, we have Alex and Richard. So let's see what we're looking for. In this case, Alex is a U.S. citizen living in the U.S. who commute each day to Canada for employment purposes. So of course, Alex drives, but is a Canadian citizen. But who computes each day. Does that make him a resident? No, he or she, Alex could be a male or a female. So he or she could be is a U.S. citizen, but it travels each day. Is not a resident of Alex is not a resident of Canada. If Alex isn't a resident, anywhere we have Alex, we can ignore it. So this does not apply to us. Now looking at second one, Bob is a U.S. Canadian citizen, but who lives in Canada. So Bob is a Canadian who lives in Canada during the week for employment purposes, but returns to U.S. on the weekend. So he comes and goes, but he has ties. Share with his spouse and a minor children. So when we think of when you think of a Bob will be Bob will be part of the he's a U.S. citizen but who lives in Canada. If you lives in Canada, you are a resident of Canada. In other words, he stays here for 5 days, goes for 2 days to U.S., comes back. So then it makes him a deemed resident. So where there is a Bob, the answer will be correct. So we have a Bob here. We have a Bob here. Now we needed to know what's happening with Charles. So then we can see where my answer is going. Charles is a Canadian citizen. So he's a Canadian citizen who lives in Toronto until March of, so he lived in Canada for the first 3 months of until March of the last year. At that time he left for a 4-year aid mission to Africa under the agreement with Canadian International Development Agency. Even though he left, but he still it still makes him deemed residence because he belongs to a Canadian International Development Agency. That makes him a deemed resident. So Charles is also a deemed residence. Now we needed to know so what's happening with Richard so we can see which answer is a correct answer. So we needed to know what's happening with Richard. Richard is a Canadian citizen so who goes to school in the US for the 8 months each year but returns to Canada to live with his parents. So he still have ties in Canada. It also makes him a Canadian deemed resident. So it also makes him a deemed resident. So to me, the answer B will be correct because Richard is a factual resident. He still have ties that he has. His parents are here. That makes him a Canadian resident. Now let's look at another question and see if we can answer this question. Now this is the next question. Of course, it is exercise 110. We're going to work out a solution. Now this is regarding a residency. We wanted to know if what's happening with the question. It is sort of knowing about the residency. Miss Suzanne Balkary was born 24 years ago in Paris, France. She's a daughter of Canadian High Commissioner serving in that country. Her father still holds this position. However, if you think about it, we want to know if Suzanne is dependent on his father. If somebody is 24 years old, they are no longer dependent. They're not dependent. If that's the first thing. Her father still holds the position. However, Miss Blakey is now working in London. So she's working in London, England. The only income she earns is from her marketing job, which pays 100,000 annually and is subject to income tax in the US. She has never visited Canada. She never came to Canada. Determined the residence status. First of all, she is 24-year-old and dependent. So it clearly states that she's no longer a dependent. She's not a deemed resident. So it's not a deemed resident. So that's the other thing. Now we know that now what happens is that why she would not be a deemed resident, because she earns an income, but she earns that income in the US if she pays the UK taxes. So, but the only part here is her father. She's a daughter of a commissioner, Canadian High Commissioner. Only if she was dependent, then the father has to report her dependent and report her income if she was dependent on him. It clearly says she's 24-year-old. She's not a dependent on him. She's not a deemed resident. Let's go to a next one. We learned about how to calculate income, and we also learned about income, net capital losses, carry forward, carry back part. So let's look at this question. They're saying for the current year, Mrs. Marie Bergen has an employment income. So my first income was, let's do that, income under, let's do that, 3A. So I will say Income Tax Act, and it is a 3A. So under the Income Tax 3A, we have something called employment income. So when you read the question, what we could do is we could see where this income is going. So we have an income of 42,000 for Maria, 680. Then what we're going to do is we're going next taxable capital gain. And when we think of a taxable capital gain, they go under subsection 3B. So we will have an income, and income under what section? Income tax A, section 3B. And then under that we have two things. We have a taxable capital gain. So that's what the first one is, taxable. The word here is taxable, means it is already half. Then what we have is next we have allowable capital loss. So we have allowable capital losses. So if we have a gain of 27,400 and we have a losses of 33,280, so my gains were lower than my losses. If my gain was lower than your losses, then what happens is that then the number, what happens is, this word is income cannot be a negative, then this will be my nil. So what happens is the difference between the both will be carried forward. Your capital loss will be carried forward. If I take, this is my positive number, this is my negative number, my number will be a negative. If you have a negative numbers, you cannot have a negative net income. We will call it a nil. Going further, they're saying we have some, then what we have is, I'm going to call it here, we have a balance from A and B. First we have a balance from A, 3A, and then 3B. So what is the balance? If you have 42,680 as my balance, we have some subdivision E deduction. So we have some subdivision E deduction. So I am going to put it here. We have the subdivision, I can't spell division, subdivision E deduction. And deductions are, if it's a deduction, I take away, how much are those? 8460. And then what happens is, once we do deduction E, we have something called balance from balance under, or you could say under, or you could say balance under income tax A, 3C. So we have 3C. So we have A, we have a B. Now we went to C. We take the difference between the both, and that will be 34,000 balance, 34,220. Now we have something called a business loss. Business loss comes under subdivision under the 3D is a deduction that is allowed under the Income Tax Act and under the 3D. So how much is the business loss? We have a business loss, and that, I don't know how much is it. I have to go back at the top to see the loss. It is 26,326. And then what do we come up with? We come up with the net income, and the net income here is my 7894. So that's my net income. Now the question can ask you, how much of the loss is carry forward? So whatever we are unable to deduct at the current year, we have a carry forward. So let's see what is my carry forward net capital loss is. So my loss was, if I were to think about, my loss was 33,280. I of course I used some of the loss because I did not pay the taxes on the gain. My loss was taxable capital loss was 33,280, and I used it against my losses, my gain of 27,400. 400. I have a carry forward. My carry forward is carry forward loss is 5,880, which I wasn't allowed to deduct. I wasn't able to use it for the current year, and then it is carry forward for the following year, so for the other other taxation years. So this was the chapter 1 that we talked about the other day. So it's always nice to do some of the question at the back of the chapter. You might have a study guides you could work with, or you could work with these questions. This will give you a refreshing on chapter 1 that we were covered. I will do a couple questions on chapter 2 and then carry on from here. Thank you so much for tuning into my channel. If you have any questions, please don't forget to send me a message underneath the video, or you could just email it to me. Thank you so much, and see you in class tomorrow. Take care and bye for now.